political advisor who has worked with leaders and governments across the world. A truly international figure, he has held senior fellowships at think tanks in London and New York, including at the Council of Foreign Relations, CFR, at the height of the Arab uprising, 2010 to 2015. While at CFR, his policy innovation memo led to the US-led creation of the Geneva-based Global Fund to help counter terrorism. Hussein is a senior advisor to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. So you can blame him for all the things you don't agree with Tony Blair, or praise him for that. This was from 2015 to 2018. From 2018 to 2021, he completed his doctoral studies on Western philosophy and Islam under the direction of English philosopher Sir Roger Scruton. He is the author of many books, including The Islamist, Penguin 2007, The House of Islam, Global History, Bloomsbury 2018, and Among the Mosques, Bloomsbury 2021. His writing has been shortlisted for the George Orwell Prize. A regular contributor to The Spectator magazine, he has appeared on the BBC and CNN and has written for The Telegraph, The Times, The New York Times, The Guardian, and many other publications. He has traveled to 40 countries. Exciting, because I'm also a frequent traveler. So please join me in welcoming Ed Hussein to the Abu Dhabi Book Fair. Welcome, welcome Ed. So Ed, I want to start with the end, with your last book, right, Among the Mosques. You say in one interview that the book is not really about Islam per se, but about the future of Britain. How so?
Well, thank you, Bilal, for that very warm welcome, and thank you also to Dr. Ali and Belant and the team for organizing such a spectacular book festival. I think that the future of Muslims in the United Kingdom is linked to the UK for several reasons. One, that the number of Muslims in the UK now stands around 5 million, and that number will grow in the next 25, 35, 40 years, disproportionate to the native population, whose growth numbers are declining, in addition to the fact that we will have more immigration from Muslim majority countries in North Africa, in South Asia, indeed parts of the Middle East. So that's the first factor. The second factor is that Muslim populations are based in northern towns, the Midlands, Birmingham, Walsall, Wolverhampton, northern towns including Bradford and Yorkshire, and in the south, which is London and elsewhere. Combined, Muslim populations now have the potential of influencing around 35 to 40 parliamentary seats, which means they can become the kingmakers of future British governments, which means that government policy will need to reflect where the activists among those communities wish to see change in relation to their understanding of Sharia. And third and finally, unlike here in the United Arab Emirates and parts of the Gulf, where there is a serious attempt for a moderate, modernized, reason-oriented form of faith, of Islam, engaging with the contemporary world, what we have in large parts of Britain is many Muslims wanting to support something like Daesh or a separatist identity, which means there will be more conflicts and clashes. And that's one reason why we see in France that the presidential election this year saw someone from the far right, and that's why we will see an increase in this far-right anti-Muslim rhetoric across Europe. So that's why I'm worried about the next 40 to 50 years and the direction of travel for the UK.
Well, Ed, unlike in Britain, we see in UAE a different form of Islam, right? I've been living here for the last 4 years, and I can truly say from inside that it's a wonderful image of a modern Islam that is tolerant and that's reflected in also the policies of the government. I mentioned, for example, the temple that's being built right now, the Ministry of Tolerance, like really a spectacular image of Islam. How do you think we can carry this model to other countries of the world, including the West, and to help the West also become more tolerant of Muslims and to diversify, the Muslim communities and change these extremist views as well? So what's your take to this?
That's a great question, Bilal. And the good news is we're beginning to see some of that happen already. So, for example, President Macron has gone out of his way to talk about the need for an Islam that is French. So he cites St. Thomas Aquinas and Allama ibn Rushd, who was a big influence on St. Thomas Aquinas 700 years ago. But President Macron has got there because of the influence of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the president now of the United Arab Emirates. He has had a huge influence on President Macron, who is looking around for a country and a model. And that's why President Macron was the first foreign leader to visit here recently with the passing of the late previous president. And that's why you see the Emirati ambassador there, Hind al-Utaiba, who is making huge progress in influencing French thinking. And that's very important for Europe, where the French lead intellectually, as you know, Dr. Bilal, that others follow. So that's encouraging. Secondly, I think in Austria we are seeing a similar movement where Sebastian Kurz, the former chancellor, was also very close to Sheikh Mohammed and the Emirati government on a similar agenda. So we're seeing that. That's the good news. And I think where there is serious, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed today is in Germany having similar conversations. So we are seeing that Emirati kind of muscular diplomacy carrying this kind of more moderate Islam. But we haven't seen that in the United Kingdom yet. And that's what concerns me, that the UK has taken a different tact, and the UK has been much more, and it's my country, so I feel free to criticize parts of it, that I think it's been much more accepting of voices that belong in the past, that belong in the 1960s, belong in a world of hatred and them and us and dislike, and we're still stuck there. And that's partly to do with Brexit, partly to do with COVID. But I think our attention will turn, and when it turns, we will need the intellectual capital and the theological treasures that have been built up here. For example, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya and his focus on maqasid al-Sharia, that we focus on what the Sharia is supposed to be about, rather than the details, which are variable based on time and place.
I definitely agree. To label it as French Islam, it probably serves a French agenda, of course. But this, I think, liberal aspect of Islam is in the religion. I think any religion can be violent and can have an extremist ideas. Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism even, right? Any religion, you'll find both different interpretations. And certainly this liberal Islam is innate also to Islam itself, in my opinion. And hence, of course, also the title of your book, right? Among the Mosques. It starts in the mosque. So my second question to you, Ed, is you seem to step away from big titles and dichotomies, right? It's not Islam versus West, right? You problematize this even more. It's a more subtle reading of these dichotomies. What is your motive behind that? What do you want to say from all these books that you've published, all these articles, wonderful articles that you've published?
There's a twofold answer to that. One is personal, and the other one is political and policy and civilizational. The personal is I was born and raised in England. I was born and raised in London. But I have a family background that's part Yemeni. My mother's part Saudi. My father has Hadrami background, but he was born and raised in India. So we have this, cocktail of identities. So the question is, who are we? And I'm not alone. There are now 35 million Muslims in the West. So what's our identity? Who are we? And in the modern world, it's not a tribal identity or a separatist identity or a religious or a sectarian identity. It's a secular contract between me as a citizen and the modern state. So that's what the modern world is about. Now, so how do we find our identity as British, French, German, and other nationality-oriented Muslims in the modern world. So that's the personal drive, that how do I ensure that the future isn't driven by terrorism and hatred. The civilizational is that since 1993, when when Samuel Huntington wrote that book, you know, the clash of civilizations. Now, we may think and say that the clash of civilization is not relevant and it's been forgotten. Now, I now live in Washington, D.C., and I'm afraid to tell you that that still is the dominant paradigm in predicting future trends. And that clash has been confirmed by, on the one hand, you know, writers and thinkers in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Pakistan and further east, and similarly in Washington, D.C., and in Harvard by Sam Huntington, and in parts of the US West Coast at Stanford and others. So it has a real influence. You know, my students are mostly now, you know, at the State Department and the White House, and I see the way they think about Muslims, 1.8 billion people in the world, as the ultimate other, you know, the suspicious other, you know, the guys who really don't belong to the contemporary world. And that, I think, is wrong. And so the writing and the thinking and the books are designed to explain, ultimately, that you cannot write or read a single book about the history of the West without remembering the debt that the modern West owes to Arabic and Islamic cultures. It's impossible.
Yeah.
It's impossible. You can write a book without the Western debt to China, to sub-Saharan Africa, to Japan, to Latin America, but you cannot write about the modern West without remembering Spain, Sicily, Syria, and indeed Arabia and its influences. So my work is designed to remind students that the West and the Muslim world, to speak of dichotomies, are sister civilizations. We're part of the same Abrahamic tradition. You know, we are not Hindus, we're not Buddhists, we're not Shinto traditionalists. You know, we are part of the same family of faiths and civilizations. So that's the design of the work, that to remind the West that it has a debt that it owes to Muslim civilization, without whom there would be no St. Thomas Aquinas, there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Enlightenment, there would be no Reformation, and there would be no modern West. So that's the thinking.
And we all, you know, we're aware that the West has always celebrated the Greek civilization, but the Greeks belong to the East more than the West in that sense. Yeah, I like this problematizing, this where you position also yourself and civilizations. But Ed, you're often misunderstood, I feel, right? I preparing for this dialogue, I've read critiques of your work, and I feel that you're often misunderstood, right? How do you think you're misunderstood, for example, and how do you respond to that?
By the way, the Greeks you mentioned, you know, the Arabs have the beautiful word for, you know, Yunaniyin, the Ionians, you know, and the children of Qahtan, and there's a whole Arabic and Yunani relationship that goes back millennia. And somehow now the Arabs preserved Greek thinking, you know, through Al-Farabi in particular onwards. You know, the Arabs are seen to be outsiders, and that's a huge strategic intellectual flaw in our modern thinking, and that's something that needs correcting.
I remember one of my teachers is Dimitri Gutas, and he wrote Greek Thought, Arab Culture, and yeah, he problematizes this. Beautiful, beautiful, Ed. So how do you think you're misunderstood?
The misunderstanding comes from two quarters. You know, I see myself, you know, broadly as someone who is small c, in the political sense, conservative. And I want to conserve the best of the West, and I want to conserve the best of Eastern tradition. And I think if we lose our heritage, we lose the bearings on which we can guide a future. So that position annoys people who are anti-institutions, anti-family, anti-government, anti-nation state, anti-status quo. They offer, almost like Michel Foucault or like Rousseau, a worldview that's confrontational and designed to call us to abstract ideas that have never been tried and tested. So that's one strand of, I think, if I may be honest, the Guardian reading far left that hates this part of the world, that seeks to undo our governments, that seeks to destroy families. So that's part of the problem in the West today. You know, you see the damage that they are doing. And then we have the Islamist far right, which, you know, has its own government sponsors, that believes in terrorism, that does not like anyone, that is advocating an Islam that is compassionate, that is kind, that is pluralist, that is civilizational, that wants to seek Islam and Western cultures to come together for a better world. They want to see a genuine clash, and they want to see, you know, you know, they don't like the grey zone is the language they use. Yeah. And I think real life happens in the grey zone, yeah. You know, in the center. So those are the two camps with which, I think Winston Churchill said, you know, if you don't have enemies, you haven't stood for anything.
Absolutely.
So I'm proud of my enemies.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, you mentioned your personal change, right, in the previous question. My question is, what did Islam, you were born a Muslim, right? What did Islam mean to you back then, when you were a teenager, for example? And what does it mean to you now after you've changed, after your journey through education and policy and etc.?
No, I think as a teenager, Islam basically meant a political ideology.
Okay.
Because that's what we were told, that there's no East, there's no West, there's only Islam. You know, that's what we were told. La sharqiyya, la gharbiyya, Islamawiyya, Islamawiyya. So when we were at university, that was the slogan. And we were told that Islam is the solution, you know. A solution to what? We didn't ask those tough questions. And then I spent 2 years studying in Syria, in Damascus, and I spent a year in Jeddah studying there with the Habaib from Hadramaut in Tarim. And then I went back and I saw the consequences of those ideas, of seeing Islam as a political ideology, and the dangers that that poses, because it's from there that you have hatred. It's from that starting point of politicizing faith that you have separatism, you have terrorism, and ultimately destruction of souls. And it was my studies there in Syria and in Saudi Arabia, combined with spending time here in Abu Dhabi with Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, and then with my teacher, Sir Roger Scruton, who is Britain's leading philosopher, that makes me see Islam now as a body of ethics. You know, it's an ethical structure that's calling us to try to live our best lives while being conscious that there is God and we have to answer to God, and we are among God's creation, and we try to be our very best. It's not complicated, and it's not political.
Beautiful. In another interview, you say that hatred to the Jewish people should end, and we should look into problems inside the house, right? I am very interested in this, given our position in Abu Dhabi, right? Can you elaborate on some of these problems?
Yes, see, this is one of the great things about Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates is that it's a pioneer. Right. And I don't say that lightly, I mean it. Having been on the receiving end of people who take a different view, for many years people like me, in the West and elsewhere felt very lonely. And it's this country that gives us confidence and companionship, because it has a worldview that's rooted in the classical understanding of Islam, and yet it's modern, and it's looking to the future. And this is why, the Abrahamic family house that's being built here confirms that we're all children of Abraham, whether our mother is Sarah or Hajra, or Hagar as we call her in English, or whether it's Ishaq or whether it's Ismail. Now, our father, Millata Abikum Ibrahim, so it confirms that breaks down the barriers. Now, where the UAE and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in particular is now, Muslim communities in Europe are about 25 years behind. So there's a reason why so many French Jewish friends are leaving France. It's not because of the far right, it's because many Muslims from an Algerian and Moroccan background bring this dislike for Jewish people and turn on them. So that's why there's been a spike of anti-Semitism. And we saw some of this in England recently, where young Muslims came down from Bradford into London and attacking Jewish people. Whereas here, you know, my Jewish friends can wear the yarmulke and walk around freely because they have security. This is what a government is supposed to provide, first and foremost, security, Max Weber's definition of what a government is supposed to provide. So I mean, this is something I say in the UK and the US mostly, that, you know, we should stop obsessing with Jewish people. Leave them alone. There are only 15 million Jews in the world. You know, let them be. They're an ancient people. They remind us of who the Bani Israeli prophets are. In the Quran, again and again, references to, and focus on our problems inside the House of Islam is
beautiful. And of course, this is reflected in وثيقة التسامح that was signed here in Abu Dhabi between Sheikh Al-Azhar and Pope Francis. And as you said, it's حرية المعتقد, right? It's this freedom to believe whatever you want to believe. Beautiful. And I do see this also on the personal level, that this country is very futuristic in its nature, right? This is reflected in the leaders who are young. This is reflected in, look at the ministries. Ministry of Tolerance, Ministry of Artificial Intelligence, Ministry of, you know, it's very futuristic, and it's really a bright image of Islam. So my other question to you is that your voice against extremist ideas is heard through the publishing industry and writing, through your books, etc. What are other possible ways for that purpose you can think about? What should we do really to have a brighter image of Islam in Britain? For example.
Yeah, sure, there are several things. One is that, you know, the voice of this kind of, you know, enlightened Islam of, you know, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and others through the ages, you know, Taha Hussein, you know, who's being honored here, which is phenomenal because he asked all the right questions. You know, that kind of critical-minded Islam that's confident, can take criticism,
right,
you know, respond robustly.
Courage.
With courage, because that's who we were. And not just killing people because they drew a cartoon. You know, my prophet is beyond that.
Yeah.
You know, so that kind of spirit hasn't been injected yet into Hollywood. Hollywood still depicts Muslims as these suspicious characters. So that's one, the film industry in Hollywood. The second is the social media space, where large numbers of young people in the West and in the East are engaged. There aren't really voices that can explain this kind of confident faith. And third is something I think Dr. Ali mentioned earlier today, which is the way that young people read now is through cartoons and pop-up books. And we haven't really catered to that young mind of how they would understand Imam Ghazali, or how they would understand you know, Al-Farabi or Ibn Tufail's story. You know, they're reading Ibn Tufail through Robinson Crusoe.
That's right.
So I think those are three immediate things that we could think about that haven't been done.
One of the projects actually of the Center for Arabic Language that we launched yesterday is a book called 101 Books of Arabic Books that influenced or enriched Athrat al-Alam, enriched the world. And it serves this function actually to introduce the achievements of the Arabic Islamic civilization to the West
this
and
is so
to the Arab
important.
world as well.
This is so important, Dr. Bilal. I can't stress how important it is, and I congratulate you and the Centre for doing this. And I say this because one of the things that pained me, I mean, at Georgetown, I have a young student whose mother is Jewish, whose father is Lebanese Christian. She works at the White House. She was involved in appointing the recent Supreme Court judge. And when she came into my course, she didn't mention who she was, or the fact that she works at the White House. Right at the end of the course, she said to me that I teach on Wednesday nights, that she would go back into the White House on Thursday mornings and discuss what was discussed in our class. And the fact that Voltaire, his characters, were coming to Istanbul, you know, in Candide, his last character comes to a derwish in Istanbul to find peace. The fact that Montesquieu writes about the Persian letters, the fact that John Locke was influenced heavily by Halabi scholarship on Maqasid, the fact that, I mean, I could go on, the fact that Burke spoke heavily about the scholarship that came out of Islamic India, the fact that Rousseau's book, Emile, draws on, and Rousseau's father worked as a watchmaker in Istanbul. So all of these people who are the French and British and Scottish, Hume cites Ibn Sina repeatedly, David Hume. We've forgotten the Arabic influence, so the 101 books, is a phenomenal way of reminding the world of the Arabic and Islamic influences on the modern world.
Beautiful. We have time for questions from the audience, if there are any questions. Okay, I don't think we have any questions from the audience, so I'll continue. So Ed, as a person occupied or interested by the idea of identity and belonging, this is a central theme in your writing. How do you position yourself as a Muslim who gives anti-Islamist views, right? Do you think, for example, that in the Muslim world we have, in the past, turned our eye from these extremist views, for example? Do you think that the problem was actually in the house here before it's in the West, or that these extremist views were a reaction to life in the West, right? Where do you position yourself with this?
I think here, especially in the Middle East, when extremist movements emerged, I genuinely believe that there was a culture of tolerance. Mm-hmm. There was an attitude that, these are our people, these are our neighbors, these are people, especially in a country like Egypt, that, they're doctors and engineers that went on state-sponsored education in Germany, in Britain, in America, and they've now come back, and maybe they'll grow out of it. You see this in even Gamal Abdel Nasser's commentary on the calls to impose hijab on universities and so on. So there was a culture of, it's not a problem. But then in the 80s, when tolerating these organizations and those ideas resulted in killing tourists, assassinating the Egyptian prime minister, and an attempt to take over the Egyptian state over and over and over again. It's important because Egypt is the largest Arabic country, and what happens in Egypt has a regional impact. I think when it reached from just conversations which were tolerated to action, then it's only right that those organizations are confronted, which is what happened. And then when a brother of one of the founders of the organization moved to Saudi Arabia and started to then change the Saudi education curriculum, it was only right that the Saudi government then clamped down. So my attitude is not one of blame, but one of understanding the context.
How did it?
It's a journey. It's a journey.
So to what extent is this? You mentioned the Muslims in Britain, and it's a country that you know, of course, very well, given your role as an advisor, but also that you lived there. To what extent these extremist ideas that are present in Britain are the result of a class issue, for example? Or policies, I don't know. There's probably many reasons for this. But where do you think the problem originated?
So I want to agree with you on the underlying assumption that it's about class or it's about government policies. I struggle with that for the following reasons. Why is it that Muslims who have come from Kurdistan, say, into Germany feel much more German or integrated, but Muslims who have come from Turkey still feel like they're outsiders? Yes, some of it is to do with Germans and the German obsession, sorry German friends here, this German obsession with kind of the racial purity and being German and the son of the soil.
Germany is the guest of honor.
I know. So hence the apology. Hence the apology.
I'm joking. No, they would agree also.
But there is this them and us culture in Germany. Ask Bassam Tibi, and Bassam Tibi will tell you that he doesn't feel German. But when in America, Bassam Tibi with Edward Said and with others, he felt American. So why is Bassam Tibi not feeling German despite being there for 45 years? But in America, he feels American. So there's something there about Germany and Europe, by extension, that isn't as absorbing of its citizens. So I think that's part of the problem on the continent. But I think Anglo-Saxon countries, England, Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, by and large have been more successful in absorbing people not based on skin color or based on blood, but based on language and culture. And that's why I see, if you look at the British cabinet, we have people, including Boris Johnson, by the way, who has a Turkish, Greek, Russian background. Our Minister of Finance, Rishi Sunak, our Minister of Interior, Priti Patel, our Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, from a Jewish background. So it's much more diverse. Similarly in America, Kamala Harris, who was here, Secretary Blinken, who was here, they're all from Austin Tice, who was here. So I think we can make a stronger argument for those countries. But on class, I mean, again, I put it to you that why is it that Muslims who come from India, from the Punjab, we have Hindus and Sikhs who come from the Punjab, who are much more integrated and successful, but Muslims are not.
Okay.
There's something else going on which I think is, in fact, ideological. And that's what we've got to get at.
So, Ed, you're obviously very well read in history, right? And you mentioned all these names, and you're teaching also history and etc. To what extent the history of the West-East relations or West-Islam relations between, of course, quotation marks, the history of the relations, right, will inform us about the possibilities of the future? Can the past teach us something about the future here?
Yes, is the answer. And this is why, again, those who talk about a clash of civilizations are wrong. Because let's take one incident in history, 1683, when the Ottomans decide to attack Vienna again and make that their path onto further European conquest. Now, yes, the Ottomans were Muslim Turks attacking Christian Europe. At a superficial level, that master narrative holds. And that's the historical example that the French far right points to, the Turkish far right points to, and others who want to see hatred and clash point to and say, remember Vienna, Vienna, Vienna. But what they forget is that it was also French Catholic France that supported the Ottoman Turks. And it was also Muslims from a Tatar background, Tatari Muslims from Poland, who protected King Sobieski, who led the charge against the Ottomans. So you had Muslims supporting Austria, and you had the French supporting the Ottoman Muslim Turks. So it's not just as simple an example of just Muslim versus Christian or Europe versus the Middle East. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And what I find interesting is the Muslims from Poland, the Tatar Muslims, they've been there for about 400 years. Their loyalty was to their country, to Poland. And that, I think, is the silver bullet that you've got to recognize in the modern world. Our loyalty is not to a caliph or a caliphate or an empire. Our loyalties are to our nation states. Those can change. We can move to different countries and take up different loyalties. But if we have loyalties that are based on racial or imperial grounds, then we go back to the past. So I think those two reasons, if we understand the modern world for what it is, based on modernity and nation states competing healthily, and if we understand that the past isn't as simple as we want it to be, then we realize that, yes, in fact, the past can help us understand the future.
Beautiful, beautiful. Any questions from the audience? Okay, my last question to you, Ed. Are you optimistic about the future of Muslims in Britain, one, and about Islam-West relations, again, between quotation marks, because these are very problematic categories?
That's a really tough question to answer, but I'm constitutionally optimistic, because I think that's the way life progresses, by wanting to live, the will to live, the desire to move on. So, and I also think, T.S. Eliot's poetry, when he said that in every decline, there's a new return. In every ending, there's a new beginning. So I think the seeds of our growth, of our progress, are always with us. So I think one of the great hopes of Muslims in the West, or especially in Britain, are are the fact that you have someone like Boris Johnson, you know, whose father or whose grandfather was Hafiz al-Quran, you know, he had memorized the Quran. So Boris has a command of Muslim history and of Islamic literature that others don't. So I think when he turns his mind to this issue, we will be in a better place. Prince Charles, for example, has a deep interest on Muslim Sufism in particular. So that bodes well for us. I also think
he even visited Sheikh Nazim in Cyprus.
He did. And I could go further back. Queen Victoria, you know, learned Urdu and you know, Rumi and Hafiz poetry.
With Abdul, of course.
Exactly. So we have a long history, I think, that can help Muslims in Britain, you know, rethink and reimagine their places without segregation and difference. You know, in the current cabinet, Sajid Javid is excellent news, and we have other parliamentarians who are coming up. But where we lack, and I think where the UAE is absolutely fundamental for improving British Islam, is that what you've done with your universities and your schools and your understanding of Islam here in the UAE, led by, you know, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and his advisors, is understanding the role of Islam and Muslims in the modern world, is that, you know, we are not seeking a caliphate, we are not seeking to destroy governments, we are not seeking to demean women, we don't hate other people. Those ideas rooted in Sharia and fiqh have not been rooted in, you know, we have over 35 different Islamic seminaries, you know, or what they call Darul Ulum, you know. Those still are running on syllabi, curriculum, going back 300 years.
This is beautiful, Ed, and it puts a responsibility on us also here in UAE. And I want to mention, because you mentioned ethics, right, and the focus on ethics, I want to mention that in all UAE schools, there is a curriculum now from childhood till the end of high school on ethics and ethical education, right, as you know, focus on this, because you know,
yes,
this is the essence of Islam.
That's the point of faith, you know. Ad-dabani Rabbi was what the Prophet said. Right. That's it, right there, you know. So this is the same in Saudi Arabia now, the return of philosophy in Saudi schools. We haven't done that in Muslim areas in the UK. So that, I think, so we can be optimistic, but cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
On East-West...
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome, of course, His Excellency, Minister of Culture, Hassan Nazim, Dr. Hassan Nazim, Minister of Culture in Iraq. You had a question, Dr. Ali? No?
Just I want to welcome you here in Abu Dhabi, and many thanks for accept our invitation.
There is a question here. The young lady in the front.
Thank you very much. This is Naima. I studied in Birmingham University, and listening to the British accent brought me back to my studies time. And also it brought me back to my experience there. And I've noticed from my colleagues in the university, people in the community, neighbors there, that there is really lack of understanding of Islam. There is a pure, like, let's say, pure audience of people who take it from one source only, which can be also misleading. And I noticed that from the questions I receive from people, and then I always say that it's not like that. And even for them to be surprised that I'm a Muslim Arabic woman coming from the Gulf countries to do her PhD in a very scientific topic, also that surprised them. And to see that from educated people also, that's in the university level, shows that people themselves, they don't put effort to understand. But I believe that's a responsibility also for education to, from university or school level as well. Especially in the UK, there is a relatively high number of Muslims. So the education is very important. Thank you.
Do you want to comment?
No, the lady is absolutely right. Education is very important, and that echoes what we were saying in terms of Muslim education is also important. So unlike here, I think one of the things that happens in the UK is every Muslim child, or most Muslim children, every evening from 5 to 7, go to study the Quran. And part of the problem is that the Quran is studied but not understood. So the Arabic language is missing. And it's a huge bonus for Arabic-speaking Muslims that you can read the Quran and understand it. But in many of those countries, communities across Europe, Turkish Muslims, Muslims from the Indian subcontinent, Muslims from Indonesia and elsewhere, don't have that command of Arabic. So when they read a verse like "In al-hukmu illa lillah," they think, right, that's just if God isn't governing, that we are living in halat al-kufr or whatever it is. So there's a real linguistic problem. So yes, the education factor is absolutely vital. The lady's right.
Part of it, I think, is also the insistence on a literal understanding of the text, right? I've read recently a book by Thomas Bauer from a German Arabist, Islam, a Culture of Ambiguity, that Islam not only is ambiguous, it wants to be ambiguous because it wants to give you multiple meanings to choose from, right? And this modern literal interpretation of like one meaning of the verse is what is driving, this narrow-mindedness somehow. Any other questions? Well, with this optimistic look at the future, we hope there are brighter Islam in Britain, brighter image of Islam in Britain, and a brighter Britain, and brighter relations between Islam and the West. So thank you. Do you want to conclude by saying anything?
No, just to reiterate that the future is really in our hands. What we do today shapes tomorrow.
Absolutely.
And Europe only became Europe because there were families of princes, the Medicis in Florence, outliers, fresh thinkers, new dreamers that supported the Reformation, that wanted popes, that looked at the classical Greek art, brought back music, literature, philosophy, art, architecture. And we see that now. We're dazzled by Rome because it was those popes between the year 1500, 1492, Machiavelli onwards, till about 1890 that redesigned the European imagination. And it was because what came out of the Florence, Venice, the Medici family and others. And I genuinely believe that there's something going on here, in the UAE, that is free from the paralysis of elections and fighting every 4 years, that gives the UAE the freshness and the space and the independence and the imaginative powers to think what the future could look like.
Absolutely.
And a better future won't be possible without the intervention of countries such as this that take a global look of where we're all headed. So,
just a visit to where I live in Saadiyat, you see the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the NYU Abu Dhabi, the Abrahamic Temple, like, it's all there. It's all there. Yeah, something is going on. So, thank you, Ed. Welcome to the Abu Dhabi Book Fair and to UAE.